At 6:45 on the morning of October 25, 1944, in calm seas roughly 60 nautical miles east of the Philippine island of Samar, a young American sailor on lookout duty aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay reported pagoda-shaped masts on the northern horizon. He was wrong about what he was seeing. He thought, for one merciful moment, that the masts belonged to American battleships. They did not. The masts belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy Center Force, 23 warships under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, including the superbattleship Yamato. Yamato's 18-inch guns were the largest naval rifles ever built. They were now, at 25,000 yards and closing, pointed at 13 American ships that had no business surviving the next 2 hours. This is the story of the Battle off Samar, the morning when 6 American escort carriers and 7 small ships of their screen, built for hunting submarines, with thin merchant hulls and almost no armor, faced down the largest surface fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled in the entire Pacific War. The American commander ordered them to charge. They charged. The Japanese fleet, after 2.5 hours, broke off and retreated. There is no other naval engagement in modern history that compares to it. 3 things will be answered in this video. How a single half-Cherokee destroyer captain attacked 4 battleships alone. What Halsey's most famous mistake cost the Pacific War. And why Kurita turned away. The 13 American ships were called Taffy 3, formal designation Task Unit 77.4.3. They were commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, age 48, of Dorchester, Massachusetts. His crew called him Ziggy. He had graduated the Naval Academy in 1918 and spent 26 years preparing for a war he had imagined would feature aircraft carriers and destroyers, not Japanese battleships shooting at his thin-skinned escorts. At 6:58 on the morning of October 25, when the first 18-inch shell from the Yamato landed in the sea 400 yards short of his flagship, Sprague said, very quietly, to his executive officer, "Well, that's that." He then ordered the only thing he could. He ordered his 13 ships to charge a fleet 10 times their tonnage. He ordered his escort carriers, slow, fragile vessels designed for ferrying aircraft, not fighting battleships, to flee east into a passing rain squall while their 7 destroyer-class screening ships made torpedo runs at the pursuing Japanese line. The first ship to obey that order, ahead of the formal signal, was the destroyer USS Johnston, hull number 557, displacement 2,050 tons. Her captain was a 36-year-old half-Cherokee, half-Creek lieutenant commander named Ernest Edwin Evans, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, in 1908. Evans turned the Johnston 90 degrees to port, increased to flank speed of 28 knots, and steered alone toward the Yamato. To understand how a Cherokee lieutenant commander came to be charging the largest battleship ever built, 60 miles off Samar in October of 1944, we have to go back 48 hours, to the night of October 23, in the Sibuyan Sea. The largest naval battle in human history was already in progress. It was called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and it would last 4 days, range across 500,000 square nautical miles, involve over 400 warships and 200,000 men, and decide whether the Japanese surface navy would survive the war. By dawn on October 25, the answer was nearly settled. But not quite. The Japanese had one card left. The card was called Operation Shogo 1. Devised by Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, it was a desperate gambit to destroy the American invasion force that had landed General Douglas MacArthur back in the Philippines on October 20. Shogo committed nearly every remaining capital ship in the Imperial Navy to one converging attack. 3 Japanese forces would approach the Leyte landing area from 3 different directions, a northern force of empty aircraft carriers serving as bait, a southern force of older battleships pushing through Surigao Strait, and a center force of 4 battleships and a dozen heavy cruisers under Kurita coming through San Bernardino Strait north of Samar. The plan required all 3 forces to arrive at Leyte at roughly the same time. Standing in the way of the Japanese plan were 2 American naval commands. The 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid was the close-cover force directly supporting the landings. The 3rd Fleet under Admiral William "Bull" Halsey was the offensive force, with the bulk of the fast carriers, tasked with destroying any Japanese fleet that approached. Kinkaid's force handled the southern force at Surigao Strait on the night of October 24, sinking 2 Japanese battleships in a textbook crossing the T action, the last battleship versus battleship gun duel ever fought. Halsey, meanwhile, struck Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, sinking the super battleship Musashi, and reported the survivors as retreating in disarray. The report was wrong. Kurita had ordered center force to reverse course only briefly to evade the air attacks. By midnight on the 24th, center force was again sailing east, toward the unguarded San Bernardino Strait. American submarines and reconnaissance aircraft did not see this reversal until it was too late. Halsey, meanwhile, had received word that the Japanese northern force, the decoy with the empty carriers, was approaching from the north. He took the bait. He turned the entire Third Fleet north to chase the empty carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely undefended. Sprague's Taffy 3, 80 miles south, did not know any of this. Sprague believed Halsey's battleships were positioned between him and Kurita. They were not. Halsey's decision is, to this day, the most controversial command judgment of any U.S. Navy admiral in the Second World War. The pursuit of the decoy carriers, north of Luzon, would draw the Third Fleet over 300 nautical miles away from the San Bernardino Strait. The strait was unguarded for 11 hours. Kurita's center force passed through it at night, into the Philippine Sea, undetected. By dawn on October 25, center force was bearing south-southwest down the Samar coast at 20 knots. 60 miles ahead of Kurita, sailing innocently into the dawn, were 16 American escort carriers in 3 task units called Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Sprague's Taffy 3 was the northernmost. Sprague's Taffy 3 would meet Kurita first. Sprague's force consisted of 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, his flagship, plus St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay. These ships were not built for surface combat. They were converted merchant hulls, displacing about 10,000 tons each, with one 5-inch gun for self-defense, an unarmored flight deck, and aviation gas tanks that ran the length of the ship. They were called jeep carriers or Kaiser coffins, after the Kaiser shipyards that had welded them together in 8 to 10 weeks each. Their official Bureau of Ships designation was CV, for carrier, escort. Sailors had a different translation. They said CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Their screen consisted of 7 warships. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, the Johnston, the Hull, and the Herman, each 2,000 tons, with 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. And 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B, Roberts, Dennis, John C, Butler, and Raymond, each 1,500 tons, with 2 5-inch guns, fewer torpedoes, and a top speed of only 24 knots. Sprague's total fighting tonnage that morning amounted to roughly 85,000 tons, the bulk of it in unarmored carriers. Kurita's center force, bearing down from the north at 20 knots, displaced over 320,000 tons. The disparity in main armament was even worse. Sprague's heaviest gun was a single 5-inch barrel. Kurita's Yamato carried 9 18-inch guns. The destroyer USS Johnston had been commissioned at the Seattle-Tacoma shipbuilding yard on October 27, 1943, almost exactly 1 year before the morning she would charge a battleship. Her commissioning officer, who delivered the standard speech to the assembled crew, was the same Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans who would command her into combat at Samar. Evans was 34 years old that day, a 1931 graduate of the Naval Academy, and one of the few American naval officers of identifiable Native American heritage. His mother was Cherokee. His father was Creek. His commissioning speech, recorded in the ship's log and quoted by every survivor of the Johnston who lived to tell the story, contained a single line that the crew would remember. Evans said, in a quiet voice that carried perfectly across the deck of the new destroyer, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. The Johnston spent her first year of service escorting convoys in the Pacific, occasionally exchanging fire with Japanese aircraft, never with Japanese surface ships. By October of 1944 she had a crew of 327 officers and men. Evans was, by every account from his surviving officers, an unusual commander, direct, undemonstrative, with a habit of standing alone on the bridge wing for long periods. He carried a small Cherokee carved bone pipe in his uniform pocket. He never lit it. At dawn on October 25, 1944, the Johnston was on routine anti-submarine patrol 3,000 yards off the port bow of the Fanshawe Bay. Visibility was excellent. The seas were running at 1 foot. Air operations had begun 40 minutes earlier. Aircraft from Sprague's 6 carriers were aloft, hunting for targets ashore on Leyte to support MacArthur's beachhead. At 6:46, an American Avenger torpedo bomber from VC-20, piloted by Ensign William Brooks, returned from his patrol leg and flashed an urgent visual signal to Fanshawe Bay. He had spotted, 15 miles north, a column of Japanese warships, including what he believed were 4 battleships and 8 cruisers. Brooks was sure of his identification. The bridge of the Fanshawe Bay was not. The bridge first assumed Brooks had sighted a delayed task group of American battleships from Halsey's Third Fleet. Sprague himself climbed to the bridge to look. Through his binoculars he saw, on the northern horizon, the unmistakable pagoda-style superstructures of Japanese battleships, the towering forward masts that were the visual signature of the Imperial Navy's heavy units. There was no doubt left. Sprague's first words were not recorded. His second order, given at 6:56, was to launch all available aircraft immediately, with whatever weapons they happened to be loaded with, depth charges, fragmentation bombs, or 50 caliber machine gun ammunition only. There was no time to rearm for surface attack. The Yamato opened fire at 6:58. The first shells from the Yamato, armor-piercing rounds weighing 3,200 pounds each, landed in the sea around the Fanshawe Bay in 3 colors. The Japanese had loaded their main batteries with die-marked shells so each ship in their line could spot its own fall of shot. The shells made fountains of red, green, and yellow water 400 feet high. Sprague's chief signalman, Yeoman First Class Charles Erickson, watching from the flag bridge, said later, "It looked like a goddamn carnival. Then it stopped being funny." The next salvo straddled the Fanshawe Bay. Sprague gave his retreat order at 7:01. He turned the carriers east, into a passing rain squall that promised to mask them temporarily, and ordered his screen to attack. The standing order to attack required the destroyers to make torpedo runs against the leading Japanese cruisers. The first ship to comply, ahead of the signal flags, was Evans's Johnston. Without waiting for confirmation, Evans had already turned 90 degrees and was steaming northwest at 30 knots toward the Japanese line, alone, more than 10,000 yards ahead of the next American warship. His torpedo officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagan, recalled in a 1985 oral history that Evans turned to him on the bridge wing and said, simply, "They're not going to outrun us. We're going in. Make the torpedoes ready." The Johnston closed to 10,000 yards on the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese cruiser column, and launched all 10 of her torpedoes in a single salvo at 7:16. 3 of the Johnston's torpedoes hit the Kumano. The first detonation ignited the cruiser's forward magazine. The second blew the bow off cleanly at frame 30. The third flooded the starboard engine room. The Kumano staggered out of formation, dropped from 26 knots to 9, and was forced to retire from the action. She would never fight again. Evans had, with 1 torpedo run, removed a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser from the line. The Yamato responded immediately. 3 of her 18-inch shells struck the Johnston in quick succession at 7:22. The first hit the bridge wing and severed Evans's left index and middle fingers. The second destroyed the after engine room. The third killed the bridge crew of the number 3 5-inch gun mount. Evans did not leave the bridge. The second American attack came at 7:35. The whole, commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger of Mansfield, Pennsylvania, charged the lead Japanese battleship in the center force, the Congo, a 30,000-ton fast battleship with 14-inch main guns. The whole's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Roberts, opened fire at 15,000 yards with her 5-inch deck guns. The shells were too small to penetrate the Congo's armor, but they damaged her superstructure and started a fire on her forecastle. The whole launched 5 torpedoes at the Congo at 12,000 yards, all 5 missed. She then closed to 9,000 yards and launched her remaining 5 at the heavy cruiser Haguro. None hit. The whole was now under fire from 4 Japanese ships at once. Within 20 minutes the hull had taken more than 40 hits from Japanese guns ranging from 6-inch to 14-inch. Her port engine was destroyed. Her steering was gone. She was making 7 knots. Kindberger continued to fight, firing his remaining 5-inch guns at any Japanese ship that came into range, until at 8:40 the hull rolled to port and sank stern first. Of her 343 crewmen, 86 were killed in the action and an additional 65 died in the water before rescue arrived more than 2 days later. Kindberger himself survived. He would say in a 1947 interview, "I never gave the order to abandon ship. The ship abandoned me." She had given everything she had. While the hull was being smashed, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, hull number D413, displacement 1,500 tons, was making her own attack. Her captain was Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, age 34, a Tacoma, Washington, attorney in civilian life who had joined the Naval Reserve in 1937. Copeland's ship was the smallest in the action. She had only 3 torpedoes and 2 5-inch guns. She had been built in 8 weeks at Brown Shipbuilding in Houston. She was rated for anti-submarine work. At 7:50, Copeland's voice came over his ship's loudspeaker. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts heard him give the announcement that 2 of his survivors would later say they remembered better than any other moment of the war. Copeland said, his voice carrying clearly above the engine noise, "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." He then turned the Samuel B. Roberts toward the heavy cruiser Chōkai and increased to flank speed of 24 knots. The crew at the torpedo mount stood at their stations. The 5-inch gun crews opened fire at 14,000 yards. The Roberts closed to 4,000 yards on Chōkai before launching her 3 torpedoes. 2 hit. The Chōkai's torpedo blisters were ruptured. She began to flood. The Chōkai, 10,000 tons displacement and the flagship of Vice Admiral Aritake Sakonji's 5th Cruiser Division, fell out of formation at 8:02. She would later be finished off by air attack from Taffy 2. Her sinking removed a second heavy cruiser from the Japanese fight. The Samuel B. Roberts, however, was now alone in front of 3 battleships and 4 cruisers. She took her first major hit at 8:20, a 14-inch shell from the Congo that detonated below her waterline and tore a hole in her port side 8 feet across. Copeland kept her firing. Her 2 5-inch guns kept up a steady rate of fire, over 300 rounds in a single 35-minute period, until both guns were destroyed by counter-battery hits. By 8:35, the Samuel B. Roberts had absorbed at least 6 battleship-caliber hits. She was burning amidships. Her engineering spaces were flooding. Her engines were failing. Copeland gave the order to abandon ship at 8:57. The Roberts rolled to starboard at 9:05 and sank. Of her 224 crewmen, 89 were killed in the action and another 31 died in the water. Copeland survived. He carried, for the rest of his life, a fragment of Chōkai shell casing that had passed through his life jacket without striking flesh. He returned to his Tacoma law practice after the war. He died on August 25, 1973, age 63. He never charged a fee for representing a member of the Roberts crew or their family. While the Hull and Roberts were dying, the Japanese cruisers continued to close on Sprague's escort carriers. The carriers were burning down by their air groups, the Avengers and Wildcats from all 6 CVEs, plus aircraft from Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 arriving from the south, were attacking the Japanese line continuously. The aircraft were carrying whatever they had been launched with, depth charges, fragmentation bombs, even unloaded machine guns, but the sheer number of attacks, over 100 sorties in 2 hours, prevented the Japanese ships from concentrating their fire on the carriers themselves. Lieutenant Robert "Pappy" Brown of VC-10, in a Wildcat with empty .50 caliber machine guns, made 4 dummy strafing runs on the Yamato to draw her anti-aircraft fire away from his attacking torpedo bombers. The Japanese cruisers found the Gambier Bay at 8:10. 3 Japanese 8-inch cruisers, Tone, Chikuma, and Higuro, closed to 12,000 yards on the trailing American carrier and began direct gunnery. The Gambier Bay was completely outclassed. Her single 5-inch gun fired back at extreme range, scoring at least one hit on the Chikuma's bridge area, but the Japanese cruiser's 8-inch shells were tearing the carrier apart. By 8:37 the Gambier Bay was burning fiercely, listing 20 degrees to port, and dead in the water. She rolled over and sank at 9:07, the only American aircraft carrier of the entire Pacific War to be sunk by enemy surface gunfire. Of her crew of 860, 154 were killed. And the Johnston, the destroyer Evans had charged into the Japanese fleet at the start of the action, was still fighting. Despite the loss of her after-engine room, the loss of her aft 5-inch mounts, the loss of her steering, the loss of her radar, and Evans's own wounds, she was still moving. With his right hand wrapped in a bloody towel, Evans steered the ship by shouting orders down a voice tube to the manual steering station in the after-emergency con. He used the Johnston to attack one Japanese cruiser, then a destroyer, then another cruiser, drawing fire away from the carriers, his 5-inch gun still firing at point-blank range. Survivors who could see him from below described him standing in plain view of the Japanese gunners. By 9:05, the Johnston had been hit by at least 45 shells of various calibers. Her port engine was failing. She was making 9 knots. She was surrounded by 7 Japanese destroyers. Evans, still on the bridge wing, ordered his remaining 5-inch guns to open fire on the closest enemy. They did. The Japanese destroyers responded with concentrated fire. Within 20 minutes the Johnston was a burning wreck. She lost all power at 9:40. Evans gave the order to abandon ship at 9:45. He was last seen on the deck near the bridge ladder, helping wounded crewmen into the water. He did not get into the water himself. The Japanese destroyer Yukake's, closing to 1,000 yards, finished the Johnston at 10:10. Of the Johnston's 327 officers and men, 186 died in the action or in the water afterward. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was among them. His body was never recovered. On the morning of October 28, 3 days later, when the surviving crewmen of the Johnston were finally rescued by American patrol aircraft, the chief torpedo man, Robert Wilson, was asked by his rescuers whether he had seen the captain go into the water. Wilson said, "No. The captain was on the deck. He was helping our men. He was waving us to swim away. The last I saw of him he was still standing." Wilson had been 13 yards from the Johnston when she went under. He saw nothing else. Then, at 9:11 on the morning of October 25, while the Johnston was still fighting, while the Gambier Bay was settling, while the hull was already on the bottom and the Samuel B. Roberts was minutes from going under, while 100 American aircraft were attacking his ships from every direction, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita aboard the Yamato gave an order that astonished every officer on his bridge. He ordered center force to break off the action and reverse course. He ordered the entire Japanese fleet to retreat. He had 7 battleships and cruisers still capable of fighting. He had no torpedo damage on the Yamato itself. He was 30 miles from the American beachhead at Leyte. He could have reached MacArthur's transports in 3 hours. He turned around. Kurita's reasons for breaking off the engagement have been debated by naval historians for 81 years. There is no consensus. The most likely explanation, supported by the testimony Kurita himself gave to American interrogators in November 1945, is that he believed he was facing a much larger American fleet than was actually present. Sprague's air attacks had been so persistent, so fierce, and so disorganized, coming from every direction with no coherent pattern, that Kurita concluded he must be facing the bulk of Halsey's Third Fleet, which would mean fast battleships and large attack carriers somewhere just over the horizon. He could not afford to be caught by superior force in confined waters. He turned the Yamato north and ordered the retreat. The American beachhead was saved. It would later become clear that Kurita's decision had also been influenced by a stack of garbled signal intelligence and by the death, on his bridge that morning, of his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tameji Koyanagi, killed by a fragment of his own anti-aircraft fire. Kurita had been at sea for 90 hours without meaningful sleep. He had lost the super battleship Musashi, 3 heavy cruisers, and now appeared to be losing more to a force he could not fully identify. He chose, in the language of Imperial Navy doctrine, to preserve the fleet for a future engagement. The fleet would never engage again. The battle off Samar effectively ended the existence of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force. Kurita died in 1977 in Tokyo. He was 88. Even as Kurita turned away, the worst single attack on Taffy 3 was still coming. At 10:51 in the morning, just under 2 hours after Kurita's withdrawal order, the escort carrier USS St. Lo, sailing in formation about 3,000 yards north of Sprague, was struck by a Japanese aircraft that did not drop a bomb and did not climb away. The aircraft, a Mitsubishi Zero, dove straight into the carrier's flight deck at full power and exploded amidships. It was the first successful kamikaze attack of the Pacific War. The St. Lo's aviation gas tanks exploded a minute and a half later. She rolled and sank within 45 minutes. Of her crew of 900, 113 were killed. The kamikaze era had begun. When the action finally ended around 2 in the afternoon, Sprague's surviving carriers turned south and rejoined Taffy 1 and Taffy 2. The total American losses for the morning were 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay and St. Lo, 2 destroyers, Hull and Johnston, and 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts. Killed in action, 1,161 Americans. The Japanese losses were 3 heavy cruisers, Chōkai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, sunk by air attack and torpedoes from Sprague's screen. Killed in action, an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 Japanese sailors. Most importantly, Kurita's center force had been turned back at the moment when the American invasion force at Leyte was completely undefended. The cost of that defense, by tonnage, was 1,200 to 1 in favor of the defenders. The men who had fought the battle off Samar would not learn until weeks later about the controversy that had nearly cost them their lives. Halsey, who had taken his fast carriers north chasing Ozawa's empty decoy carriers, had failed to leave any covering force at the San Bernardino Strait. When Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor learned that Taffy 3 was alone against center force, he sent a coded inquiry to Halsey, "Where is Task Force 34? For coding security purposes, padding phrases were inserted before and after the message. The closing padding read, "The world wonders." By accident, the decoded version Halsey received read like a sarcastic rebuke. Halsey, on the bridge of his flagship, threw his cap on the deck and wept. Halsey turned the Third Fleet around within 30 minutes of receiving the message. By the time his battleships were within range of Kurita's retreating center force, the Japanese had already escaped back through San Bernardino Strait into the Sibuyan Sea. Halsey's career survived the controversy. He was promoted to Fleet Admiral the following year, but his judgment on October 25, 1944, has been a permanent stain on his record. The Naval History and Heritage Command's official assessment, published in 1958, said only, "The American victory off Samar is attributable to the surface and air actions of Taffy 3. The cost of saving the beachhead, in lives and ships, was significantly higher than it should have been because of decisions taken at higher command." Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously by President Roosevelt in May of 1945. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the battle off Samar." Evans was the first Native American naval officer to receive the Medal of Honor. The award was presented to his widow, Margaret Evans, at the White House on October 23, 1945. She accepted it without speaking publicly. She returned to Pawnee, Oklahoma. She raised their 2 sons. She never remarried. She died on June 3, 1992, at the age of 78. The Johnston rested at the bottom of the Philippine Sea for 75 years. The Samuel B. Roberts was located 18 months after the Johnston, on June 22, 2022, by the research vessel Pressure Drop, operated by the explorer Victor Vescovo. She was found at 6,895 meters, 22,621 feet below the Pacific surface. She immediately replaced the Johnston as the deepest known shipwreck in the world, a record she still holds in 2026. The video survey showed her hull broken in 2 pieces. Her bow gun was still trained outboard. The destroyer Escort had been built in 8 weeks in Houston in 1944 to escort convoys, had charged a Japanese fleet, and had ended her existence at the deepest point ever surveyed for any wreck of any kind. The Vescovo team called her, simply, the destroyer that fought like a battleship. The named survivors of Taffy 3 lived long, mostly quiet lives. Captain Robert Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts received the Navy Cross. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague was awarded a Second Navy Cross for his command at Samar. He died of a heart attack on April 11, 1955, at the age of 58, only 10 years after the battle that had defined his life. The last surviving Taffy 3 officer, Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, Evans's torpedo officer aboard the Johnston, the man who had heard the captain order the first attack, died in Houston, Texas, on June 23, 2017, at the age of 95. He had attended every Johnston survivors reunion from 1949 to 2014. He kept a small Cherokee carved bone pipe in a velvet box on his mantelpiece. Why Kurita turned away from the American beachhead at Leyte on the morning of October 25, 1944, and so handed the Pacific War to the United States 2.5 years before its formal end, has been the subject of 14 serious historical books and countless naval staff papers in 3 languages. The simplest answer is the one Kurita himself gave under interrogation in 1945. He believed he was about to be attacked by a much larger force, and he could not see the entire battlespace clearly through the smoke. He was wrong. The smoke had been laid by destroyers a tenth his size, attacking him with torpedoes that had mostly missed and guns too small to dent his armor. He was deceived by the appearance of fury, not its substance. The deeper answer is that Kurita was deceived by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans of Pawnee, Oklahoma, who had charged the Yamato alone with 1 destroyer at 7:16 in the morning, fired all 10 of his torpedoes at the cruiser Kumano, taken 3 18-inch shell hits to his ship in the next 6 minutes, lost 2 fingers in the process, refused to leave his bridge, and continued to attack the Japanese line for the next 2.5 hours until his ship was a hole in the water. The Japanese commander could not believe that an American force willing to behave that way was small. He concluded it must be large. He acted on the conclusion. He turned away. The cost was paid in full. 1,161 American sailors died at the Battle off Samar so that the unguarded San Bernardino Strait would not be the Pacific War's last great catastrophe. The escort carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo, the destroyers Hull and Johnston, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts went down with their crews because they were the only ships in the Imperial Navy's path that morning. They went down attacking. The American beachhead at Leyte continued unmolested. The Imperial Japanese Navy never mounted another major surface action. 2.5 years later the war ended with the Yamato also at the bottom of the Pacific, sunk on April 7, 1945, by aircraft from carriers similar to the ones she had failed to destroy at Samar. So this is the question the battle off Samar leaves us with, 81 years after Sprague gave his retreat order and Evans turned the Johnston into the Yamato's guns. When a force 10 times your weight bears down on you in clear morning weather 60 miles from a beachhead full of soldiers who depend on you, and your largest gun is 1/6 the size of the smallest gun firing at you, what is it that decides the outcome? It was not equipment. It was not numbers. It was not even, by any standard naval calculation, possible. The only thing standing between Center Force and MacArthur's transports that morning was the willingness of 13 American ships to charge first and hardest. They charged. The Japanese fleet turned around. The wrecks are still down there. Their hulls are still pointed north.